Welcome to the fourth edition of the Enfield Microphone, Summer 2001. We bring you a hodgepodge of goodies to enjoy, we hope. And don't forget, you don't have to return it immediately, so you've got plenty of time to indulge yourselves. As the ETN is embarking on its next 40 years, Robin starts by taking you on a journey through memories of the past 40.
I wonder how many of the original recipients of the Enfield microphone are still receiving the weekly news, and, now of course, the twice-yearly magazine, which perpetuates the name of Enfield microphone. I'm at the controls of the microphone's time machine, and I've set the switches to the early days, so I'll just press the button.
The news tape was started by Toc H, so who better to tell us about it than John and Gladys Dredge, who were closely involved in the scheme from the beginning.
It started in 1960. I remember one Friday night I was going to Toc H, and Maurice Strivens, who some of you may remember, an old Toc H member, put the project to me in the car, and I was very keen on it. So we mentioned it at the branch meeting, and the chaps got interested. And Maurice Strivens arranged to see the manager of Howard's, the radio shop in the town, and the manager agreed to let us have 2 Simon Symbol tape recorders and maintain them free of charge, provided they were used for the blind. He also went along to see the editor of the Enfield Gazette, and he got his cooperation as well. And Richard Collinson was the reporter at the time. He'd done a lot of work with the project. And Miss Albert, of course, who was there from the beginning.
Gladys, it was about 1960.
About 1960, yes. I remember Christopher was about 11, because I remember one night we used to, from time to time, have difficulty with readers. Usually it was the Toc H men, and they were involved in other things, and they couldn't always come, so sometimes they were short of readers, and one night we had 2, and they brought Christopher in to do it, and I think he then was the youngest reader. He has read on it since he's grown up, but he doesn't do it now. But now a family tradition is kept up by Peter Sykes, our nephew.
You, of course, were probably the first listeners, and probably the last of the first listeners remaining. I can't think of anyone else.
Mrs. West, who is now no longer with us.
And how many people did Toc H sort of get round?
Oh, I just don't work out. There's about 12, yes. The 2 machines used to go round to 6 to 7 people. But they used to go round once a week then, and it was rather an involved transport business, because not only did the Toc H men read on the tape each week, but they used to provide the transport. And we had a little shop at the time, and as we were always open, or more or less always open, available anyway, and on the spot, and we had a telephone, I used to look after the transport part of it, and it was a headache at times, especially when the machines went wrong or the tapes all came undone, and it was a hectic job to get them all back into their cassettes.
Now I'll set the controls to the 24th of February 1962.
We welcome you to Enfield Microphone number 12 in a slightly different style from usual. Our dateline is Sunday, 24th of February, and we bring you a historic edition of the Enfield Gazette. For this week's issue was published twice in one day, with 2 front-page lead stories. This was due because a very big news story about the borough merger was not known until the Gazette was actually being published. So production was stopped and a new story added. But first, the big lead story of our fortnight. The story of the frightened witness. A witness waiting to give evidence in a case of malicious damage at a public house at Enfield Magistrates' Course on January the 28th hurried away without giving evidence after being threatened by a man in a toilet near the court entrance. This was stated at Enfield.
The 500th edition on the 18th of September 1982 carried this news item.
Arsenal and Northern Ireland football star Pat Jennings presented a cheque for £1,000 to the Guide Dogs of the Blind Association at the Gun and Magpie pub in Enfield last Thursday. The money was raised through a series of raffles at the pub in Hertford Road, organised by 3 regular customers, Mr. Reg Warren, Mr. Keith Minton and Mr. Alan Farrington. Whitbread's area manager, Mr. Brown Waterman, was at the pub along with representatives from the Sherlock Holmes pub in the West End, who trained Mr. and Mrs. Anthony and Anne Pembury, landlords of the Gun and Magpie. Pictured in the photo in the Gazette are our listeners John Davis and Hugh Crane.
On edition 600, Harvey is reading a report on the first ever edition.
We were one of the first such organisations to appear in this country, a quarter of a century ago. The Enfield Gazette of Friday, May the 19th, 1961, records the following on its front page. About 15 elderly and blind people sat in a room at the British Legion Club, Cecil Road, last Friday, and heard the news, not from the voice of a BBC announcer, but from a local voice, giving a summary of the local news from the Gazette and Observer. The idea of making a tape recording came from members of Enfield Talk H. They invited the blind folk along to their meeting room. After the first news tape, there were cries of wonderful and marvellous. The article goes on to note that out of the 100 blind people thought to be living in the area, only 10 had come forward requesting such a service. The week-by-week selection would probably be recorded on the Gazette's publication day, the master recording circulated to the blind folk, each keeping it for about 24 hours. Only one machine was being used, but it was hoped that more would be obtained. Last week's broadcast had been done by a certain Mr. and Mrs. Dick Turpin of Ladysmith Road, and one item had concerned his historical namesake, the highwayman. Others present included Councillor L.C. Merrion, chairman of Enfield Old People's Welfare Association, himself blind, Mr. L.E. Francis, the branch secretary, and John Dredge.
The worst scenario that can confront the presenters is that no one turns up for the recording. Fortunately, this is extremely rare. But on the 2nd of February 1995, this is exactly what confronted Peter Sykes. He was the only person to arrive. So, he was head cook and bottle washer, or more precisely, engineer and reader of all the articles.
Welcome to the 1006th edition of the Enfield Microphone, dateline 2nd of February 1995. On this occasion, your readers are, well, it's actually just me, Peter. Alan is away on business, and Marjorie and Joyce can't get here because of the weather near Oakwood and Cockfosters, where they live. And apparently there's quite a lot of snow falling there at the moment, and the forecast is for it to be very cold and freezing tonight, so although they might be able to get here, they've decided that they will probably have quite a bit of trouble getting back. One of them lives on a fairly steep hill, apparently. So I've also been unable to contact Tony. I'm not quite sure where he is tonight, so it looks like you're going to have to put up with me all through the tape, so I hope you don't bore easily. We start with a brief reminder about our AGM. Don't forget, our annual general meeting is this coming Wednesday, the 8th of March. Please come.
From 40 years we go to 40 Hall with John.
This account about 40 Hall by Geoffrey Gillam appeared in the Enfield Independent. 40 Hall has been a premier Enfield landmark from the early part of the 17th century. Nicholas Rainton, a wealthy London merchant, purchased the manor of Worcesters in 1616 from Sir Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury. 13 years later, he built 40 Hall on part of the land. The house was ready in 1632. Additionally, Rainton owned property in 40 Hill and purchased a lease on Enfield Palace in the centre of Enfield, although there is no evidence that he actually stayed there. He retired to 40 Hall in 1642 after making his money by importing satin and taffeta from Florence and velvet from Genoa. Rainton was elected Lord Mayor of the City of London in 1632 after serving as Sheriff and Alderman. He was knighted in 1633 and was also President of St Bartholomew's Hospital. He died at 40 Hall in 1646, having outlived all his family. An elaborate monument featuring a reclining figure of Sir Nicholas clad in armour can be seen in St Andrew's Church, Enfield Town, and the family are buried in a vault below the vestry room. The estate was inherited by Rainton's young great-nephew, also called Nicholas. In 1683, Nicholas was suspected of concealing conspirators who had planned to kill Charles II and his brother James during a journey from Newmarket to London. A search of Forty Hall by soldiers found no evidence against him. After his death in 1696, the estate was passed on to his daughter Mary and husband Sir John Wolstenholme, and 2 years later to their son Sir Nicholas Wolstenholme. By 1707, the estate was put in the hands of trustees after falling into debt. In the centuries that followed, the house continued to be passed on to a succession of dynasties, including local magistrate James Meyer in the early 1800s. It remained in the possession of his family until Henry Carrington Bowles, who lived at Middleton House, bought Forty Hall for his son Henry Ferryman Bowles in 1895. He served as Enfield's Conservative MP from 1889 until 1905, and again from 1918 to 1922. The estate was sold by Bowles' family to Enfield Urban District Council for £43,000 in 1951, and was opened as a museum and the grounds given public open space status. Forty Hall is set to be formally handed over by the local authority to a trust later this year.
Bringing us to the present day, Mabel has been reading the dictionary.
I've often wondered from where the word shoddy came from. The usual use infers inferior workmanship, pretense, or sham. I've now found out shoddy was the waste product of the wool industry, and gradually the residue from silk working became incorporated with the shoddy. This material had a nitrogen content of up to 17% and was used as a very early form of slow-release fertilizer, particularly suitable for vines and hops, which need a continuous supply of food throughout the year. The use of shoddy on the land goes back a very long way. It is tempting to think that it has now been superseded by the readily available chemical fertilizers, but apparently this is not the case. A commission was set up in the 1980s by a large manufacturer of woolen garments in the United Kingdom to investigate the use of shoddy in Europe, and the findings confirmed that the practice certainly continues to the present day. Just north of Florence in Italy is the textile town of Prato. This is the shoddy capital of Europe, and it provides a high proportion of woolen cloth to all the major European and American chain stores. Prato achieved this position by installing extremely sophisticated machinery, capable not only of weaving and finishing, but also of sorting fibres rapidly and efficiently. Previously, the shoddy was either produced at Dewsbury in England or Castres in France. A major problem of collection of waste wool today is that most of it is coloured, and frequently by synthetic dyes. The fashion industry plays a very large part in the process. Shades which are the height of fashion one year are totally rejected the next, and it is not economical to bleach or re-dye these highly coloured wools. They are baled and sold to local farmers for fertilizer. It will be interesting to see if there are any effects from feeding vegetables on bright purple or orange wool. Far from being a cheap manufacture for impoverished peasant farmers to use, the farmers of Tuscany choose to use shoddy, although they are well able to afford the readily available chemical fertilizers. In earlier times, Norfolk and Norwich particularly were leaders in the production of wool and silk. It must therefore be assumed that throughout the years there must have been a considerable amount of waste product available for the land. To date, though, only records have been found showing the use of wool on the land in Hertfordshire and Oxfordshire. Perhaps other records may be found in the future.
And now to the seaside with Audrey and John.
John and I are in Swanage this weekend because it's the Swanage Folk Festival. and our friends assure us we really will enjoy it.
We are waiting on the seafront for the music to start and for the Morris men to make their way along the promenade. It's a beautiful sunny day and the crowds are out in force. The mums and dads and the children enjoying ice creams.
What a good idea. I fancy an ice cream. Oh, I don't think this time. I think I can hear the music. They must be about to start.
They were the Darset Buttons going past. The Morris group certainly have very rustic names. According to the programme, there are the Bog Hoppers and the Bush Beaters, not to mention the Cloggies.
I think I can hear the next group coming now. They're the Spit-haired Morris.
Dancing non-stop. Oh, what a surprise. I've just seen a group wade into the sea to dance and play.
Oh, so you have. It's a bit cold and wet, I should think, and all their lovely outfits will get wet. Shall we go to the craft fair now and see what they have to offer?
OK, and tomorrow we will go to the folk festival service.
We're now in St Mary's Parish Church, Swanage. We have just been listening to the folk musicians, and now the vicar will say his words of welcome.
Festival folk friends, you've come to the Swanage home of old Harry Morris, of Lammas and Swanage Bay, of the Purbeck Village Choir and the Greenwood Tree Band, where the quayside cloggies and the hobos and Nancy cousins come from over the harbour and into the county of Dorset Buttons.
And now the Darset Buttons are getting ready to dance down the church nave. A very lively dance, holding metal strips called rappers. David is going to tell us about it.
The rappers are actually flexible blades which were used many years ago in the mining towns. They were actually used for cleaning pit ponies, and they used to scrape all the muck and the sweat off the ponies with them. And when these got sort of clogged with grime and what have you, they used to actually rap them against the walls, which is why they're called rappers. So this dance is actually from the northeast, from the mining areas. This has got a slight variation insofar as that we dance it in clogs. So it's our Dorset variation, really.
So if any boys and girls like to come round the front here where they can see without getting wrapped, that'd be grateful. If parents want something to get the mud off their children, here's a novel way of doing it.
outside now, and we'll leave them to their dancing. I can tell you that at the end of the Dorset buttons, they hold up a star shape made out of the metal wrappers that they have woven and intertwined while they were dancing. Very clever, and quite dangerous, it seemed to me.
Well, it has been a great weekend. I can thoroughly recommend a visit to Swanage when the Folk Festival is on. It has been really good fun in Swanage by the sea.
One thing Audrey and John did not mention was the donkeys on the beach, but Tessa has visited them on land.
A few years ago, I was holidaying in Sidmouth in Devon when I came across the donkey sanctuary. I drove into the drive and found myself in the most amazing place I've seen. It had been started by Dr. Elizabeth Svensson in 1969 to provide care, protection and permanent security for donkeys in need of attention because of sickness and maltreatment, poor circumstances, ill usage or other causes, and the prevention of cruelty and suffering among donkeys. There are donkeys everywhere, in fields and stables, and even a donkey's hospital. But what impressed me was the Slade Centre, which had been set up. The older donkeys are looked after in their retirement, but the younger ones are trained to help provide riding centres for children with special needs and disabilities. And today there are centres in Leeds and Birmingham as well as Sidmouth. Regular newsletters are sent out, and they include reports of rescues and incidents which occur, and I thought you'd like to hear some of them. Some months ago, one of their lorry drivers had the extremely difficult task of picking up 7 neglected and terrified donkeys, which were the result of a joint rescue operation with the RSPCA. It took nearly 3 hours of the efforts of 2 members of the sanctuary and 3 RSPCA officers to load the terrified animals safely onto the specially adapted lorry for their journey to Devon. 6 of the donkey mares were in foal, and the stallion accompanied them into the sanctuary. The whole group now has its own little family stable and run-out yard, and over the months, with gentle, loving care, they've begun to trust humans again, and recently 2 black foals have emerged. 2 miniature donkeys, Jack and Naomi, settled in nicely, but they weren't without their problems. Jack had to visit the vets to be castrated, as there's no way the sanctuary would deliberately want to increase the number of donkeys they have in their care. Naomi was with Jack while he was anaesthetised, and was by his side when he came round. After a couple of days, he didn't seem at all concerned by the event. Maybe they should have reminded him. It was thought Jack and Naomi would be happy to join the group of geriatric donkeys in the main yard, with lots of friends, staff and visitors to spoil them. Having moved them, Dr. Svensson was looking through her window while talking on the telephone a few days later, and was astounded at what she saw taking place. There was old Candy G, quietly enjoying her special breakfast, which always takes a long time as she's very few teeth left, and behind her stood Wicked Jack, obviously getting ready to give Candy a surprise. He was pawing the ground with his little hoofs, and then, gathering himself up to his full height, about half Candy's size, he tried to mount her. Poor Candy. For a second her head was pushed into the bucket, and her expression when she turned round appeared to be of complete bewilderment. With a shake of her hind quarters, Jack promptly fell off, and with a grunt of satisfaction and a half-hearted but well-aimed kick, Candy resumed eating her breakfast, and Jack retreated. Dr. Svensson ran down to the yard and was told Jack had tried similar antics with the same results, with half the elderly mares in the yard. Jack and Naomi now have their own private quarters in what are known as beach boxes, and hopefully time will solve the problem.
Len Patton is a beekeeper and is very knowledgeable about their history.
I think in this country we've got about 87 different insects in the bracket that bees fall in. But only one of those, and that is Apis mellifera, to give it its Latin name, is the honeybee, and no other bees are used commercially to obtain honey. Although I said that the honeybee had existed for millions of years, he's only been manipulated in boxes, which are hives, for about the last 150. Before then, bees were kept in skeps. Skeps are those beehive-shaped straw rope devices in which the peasants got a swarm of bees, which he'd probably got out of a tree or somewhere, and persuaded them to go into the skep. They'd attach themselves to the inside of the skep, and they produced their own comb, which is rather like a giant teardrop, in layers inside the skep. And when they were all full up with honey and capped, these great teardrops with their little hexagonal cells, they used to light a fire and hold the skep over the fire so the smoke came up, doped all the bees dropped out of the skep, and they took the skep away and extracted the honey by putting it into a porous bag and squeezing it until all the honey came out through the bag and the wax stayed behind. By experimentation, it's supposed to, I believe, been an American, found out that if he could devise some way to make a box with panels in it which he could remove, and he could train the bees to produce this hexagon-shaped comb, he could then extract the panels one by one, get the honey out and put the combs back, and they'd do it again. And he found that out, that if he stacked the panels a certain distance apart, the bees did just that. And it's called the bee space between the two, between the panels. And all hives that are made today commercially have got a little spacer between the combs, as they're now called, not panels. And as long as that space is observed, then the bee will do just that thing. He will produce combs of honey. And these days we assist the bee by giving him a base about 1/16 of an inch thick, in which has been as embossed on both sides with this hexagonal shape. And it gives the bee a starter. So don't forget he's working in the pitch black. And it saves time. And the bee draws up and forms little tubes, hexagonal shaped, with wax which it produces between the scales on its body. At a certain time during the bee's existence, which is very short in the summer, he produces little tiny plates of honey which are exuded between the scales on its body. And they're all collected, and there's thousands of bees, and they masticate it and they build up the comb. Then other bees fill up the comb with nectar, and then other bees, after it's had the sufficient amount of water evaporated out of it, cover the comb over with a thin cover, like putting the bit of stuff on the top of a jam pot that you see. And that's how it's done. And then you can lift the comb out and you extract it by removing that cover and putting it into a centrifugal extractor, and by whipping it round at a fast speed, you can imagine, you can persuade the honey to come out of the comb, where it all falls into the bottom of the extractor, and you draw it off into your jars after having filtered it, because there's bits of bee in it, you see.
While you eat your honey on toast and listen to Summertime, let the tape run to the end, turn it over, and join us for the second act.